Okay, gonna do a vlog today on the Trojan War and my interest in it. So yeah, just quick background. I've been doing kind of a few vlog series in which I just pick a topic that's of interest to me, turn the camera on, and just kind of ramble a bit. I've got a few notes of points I want to hit on, but this isn't really scripted. Just a forewarning, usually these end up being kind of rambling and incoherent. Sorry, you're warned ahead of time. Rambling and incoherent. I've been picking a lot of topics recently that are kind of stuff I know about, and a lot of them have kind of been kind of semi-obscure. You know, the Japanese student movement, Sandinista revolution, and Christian periodicals, which kind of maybe justifies rambling for 30 minutes at the camera. The Trojan War is less obscure. It's not quite as famous as it should be, or as it used to be kind of in modern culture, but it's, you know, something well documented. You can find like 20 other videos on YouTube that are probably going to explain this much better than I am. So in that sense, this is maybe not filling a niche that anyone needs to just kind of ramble about it. But I'm gonna give it a go, see what happens. Maybe I'll say something interesting. If anyone out there kind of knows anything, if you pick up on any details that I miss or kind of have some insight that I don't, feel free to kind of put it in the comments. So the Trojan War was something I was really interested in around middle school, kind of 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and it spilled over a little bit till 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade a bit. Yeah, I guess most of my youth, kind of most of my adolescence and teenage years, I was really into the Trojan War. Now, to give my dates, I'm 40 now, so this is some years in the past now. And I haven't been reading up on it recently that much. So the memory does fade a little bit, but actually I feel like I still remember this kind of enough to talk about it intelligently. And I also find, this is a tangent, but let me know what your experience is. I find actually that I remember the stuff I studied when I was a teenager. I remember that kind of stuff better than stuff I studied 5 years ago. I don't know what it is. Maybe when you're young, everything is new to you, so it kind of makes a huge impression, or something about the brain plasticity, or who knows, maybe it's an illusion. Maybe I'm not remembering it as well as I think I'm remembering it. But I feel like a lot of the kind of stuff I was really interested in when I was kind of, 12, 13, 14, I can still remember it kind of quite clearly. At least that's how I feel. So, to kind of go through briefly how I got interested in this whole thing. I was at my cousin's house. My cousins lived kind of 6 hours away, so I only kind of saw them a couple times a year. And I was kind of staying with them for a week or a weekend or something like that. And at their house, they had just been to the library, and they had all these kind of picture books on Greek mythology. Now, they were kind of small books, I don't know how long they were, 12, 20 pages at most, mostly kind of full of pictures, a little bit of text. But it was really interesting. We just kind of dived into it, and I was kind of going through and reading about, Odysseus and the Cyclops, and the Sphinx, and all the other kind of monsters, the Hydra and Hercules, and all the monsters of Greek mythology. Another side note here. You've really got to respect Greek mythology. It is so inventive. It's really kind of withstood the test of time in the sense that all these monsters and heroes and creatures are just kind of so imaginative that they were kind of fascinating 2,000 years ago, and they're kind of fascinating to a kid nowadays. A lot of the stories, the kind of actual stories themselves and kind of the beats of the stories and kind of the propensity towards tragedy maybe is not so modern, but kind of the imagination behind all these creatures is like, it's any kind of science fiction or comic book that you get today is not quite half as imaginative as a lot of this stuff from Greek mythology. So yeah, for a 12, 13-year-old kid, it's just really interesting. Now, one of the books was about the Trojan War, and my cousins said to me, "Oh, read this one. This is really good." And I said, no. I wanted to read the other ones instead. And I don't remember where, but somewhere in my life, I had kind of picked up enough cultural knowledge to know that the Trojan War involved the Trojan horse, where the Greeks kind of were in the Trojan horse, and then they got taken into Troy, and then they kind of came out. And I don't remember where I learned about the Trojan horse. I think maybe it was a comic book, maybe one of those Uncle Scrooge comic books where like they make a reference to it, or they reenact it, or they go back in history. I picked it up somehow. And I thought, even as a kid, I thought, that's pretty stupid. I mean, that's kind of a stupid story. I mean, the Greeks and the Trojans are fighting a war. The Greeks go away. There's this big horse left outside the city of Troy. And the Trojans say, oh, well, let's just bring it into the city then. No need to think about this. And then they bring it into the city, and then the Greeks come out and destroy the city. And that was the only part of the story I knew, and I thought, oh, that's stupid. I'm not going to read that part. I'm going to go on another digression here. This is kind of jumping ahead a little bit in the story. But yeah, a couple of things about the Trojan horse for maybe people who aren't so familiar with the story. One, when you actually kind of get into the Trojan War, the Trojan horse is not actually, so it's like the least interesting part of it. It's not, the story isn't about the Trojan horse. The story is about kind of the 10 years of fighting before the Trojan horse. So like the Iliad, which is kind of the most famous book associated with the Trojan War, kind of ends like 9 months before the Trojan horse even kind of comes on the scene. So, it's just kind of 9 months in the middle of the war before the Trojan horse. So there's that. The other thing, I don't know, I suspect, maybe if somebody has studied this, they could fill me in. I suspect maybe the Trojan horse was kind of one of those ancient parts of the story that the later story writers were just kind of stuck with. Because the Trojan War kind of went through several generations, and it got more and more elaborate with each retelling. And I think with each retelling, it got kind of, the themes got more serious and more intricate. I think maybe the Trojan horse was just kind of one of those kind of early relics from the beginning of the story that they were just kind of stuck with. You can see it in some retellings about the Trojan horse, that the storyteller knows it's so stupid to take this horse into the city. So they create all these elaborate reasons why the Trojans kind of really get pushed or forced to take the horse into the city. Like they're told that the horse is sacred to Athena and she'll curse them if they don't do it. And then somebody tries to warn against the horse and they get eaten by a sea monster because the gods are kind of in on it. So the gods are kind of trying to help trick the Trojans into taking the Trojan horse into their city. So, if you have all those other reasons kind of combined on it, then it does kind of make some sense. And I have the feeling that you started off with the basic story of the Trojan horse, and then all those extra reasons to try and justify why the Trojans would be so stupid kind of come in later to the story. I don't know. I guess the point is, the Trojan horse part is a little bit, it's kind of a disappointing end to the story, but like the main part of the story is not the Trojan horse. That's the part everybody knows, for better or for worse. Anyways, I never read the book. I don't know why I didn't. I guess we had a limited amount of time and there were other books that caught my imagination, or I was stubborn or whatever. And then I left and I went back to my home 6 hours away, and it was just kind of nagging at me like, what was in that book that my cousins really liked so much that I never read and never found out about? Was it just a stupid story about the horse, or was there more to it? Then I was in my school library one day, and they had the book called The Trojan War by Olivia Coolidge. Now this is an old book. I think it was published in the 60s or 70s or something like that. But it's one of those books that's kind of still a classic, so you can still track it down or still buy it. If you ever come across this book, I highly recommend it. It's written kind of at about a 6th grade reading style, but she just does a masterful job of taking all the different stories from the Trojan War and putting them together into kind of one volume. And it's been years since I read it, but I remember thinking it was quite a thick book. And it is kind of at a 6th grade level, so I think the print is quite big and stuff like that. But it was a quite hefty book. And I thought, oh wow, there is a lot more to this story than I thought. Because the book my cousins had was like a small little picture book. So I thought, okay, I am going to read this book and I'm going to know everything about the Trojan War, and then I will be the expert on the Trojan War, and I'm going to go back to my cousins. Actually, it wasn't all about ego. As a kid, I was always kind of fascinated by epic stories. I had this idea that kind of the longer and more complicated the story is, the better. I don't know. So some people are like that. So the idea that the story was this intricate and this long really kind of fascinated me. And it is kind of a fascinating story once you get into it. All the little different strands that go into the Trojan War and all the little characters and narratives and stuff like that. And it's Olivia Coolidge starts way kind of at the prequel to the Trojan War, kind of the wedding between Peleus and Thetis, and how this kind of set off a chain of events which would eventually lead to the Trojan War, and then the whole thing about the Trojan War, and then, yeah, so there's just all these events going on. And I read the whole thing, and I was fascinated by it. There's also, I'll come into this a little bit later, but it's quite a violent story. I mean, it's a story about a war. And 12-year-old boys are fascinated with violence for whatever reason. So I was kind of fascinated by the war aspect of it. Although it was a bit of a strange, from a modern standpoint, it's a little bit difficult to get into the story. Because when you're trying to enjoy violence vicariously, you want to believe that that violence is justified. So like if you're watching a superhero movie, you enjoy the superhero beating up on the bad guys because it's justified. You wouldn't kind of get the same vicarious thrill of seeing like a good guy beat up on some innocent guys. The human psyche, I don't know. Who knows what's going on there? Now the thing about the Trojan War is like in the stories, the authors kind of make you sympathize with both the Greeks and the Trojans, or different authors have different takes on it. But if you're reading kind of a story that combines a lot of different takes, it's difficult to kind of, you really can't root for one side or the other because they both have kind of sympathetic points and they both kind of do horrible things at points. But there is a fascination with it nonetheless. So to a certain extent, I didn't know what to make of it. I think to a large extent, that's kind of true of modern audiences in general, which is why this thing that was kind of so famous in the ancient world has just been impossible for Hollywood to do anything with. I mean, I know they've tried a few times, but you just can't make a modern movie out of this because it doesn't have kind of the beats that a modern audience would expect about a good guy kind of beating the bad guys. But more than that, I was just kind of fascinated by the epicness and the sprawlingness of the story. And I kind of found out that the Iliad was one of the major sources behind the Trojan War. The Iliad is an epic Greek poem. And I kind of found some versions of the Iliad in the library, and I was just kind of thumbing through it. And I thought I kind of knew everything, because I thought, okay, I've already read Olivia Coolidge's book. She covered all this stuff in there. But then I start kind of thumbing through the Iliad, and I begin to realize that Olivia Coolidge had only kind of summarized certain parts of the Iliad. Like, there were lots of details she left out. There were kind of whole chapters of the Iliad she had left out. And it began to bother me that there were details of this story I didn't know. Now, this is kind of a personal effect, but I think there are other people out there who have the same personality, and maybe you can identify with this. When you get into a story, you just get obsessed with knowing all the details. The kind of people who can never read an abridged version of a book because you'll just be thinking, there's some details that got left out that I don't know about. It's a bit of a strange personality thing, but I think there are other people out there like that who can maybe identify. So I started to try and kind of collect all the kind of stories about the Trojan War, and I wanted to kind of synthesize it all into one story. I had this plan. I was like 12 or 13 at the time, and I thought, right, over the next 10 years, I'm just going to collect all the stories on the Trojan War, and then like when I'm 22, then I'm going to write this great epic book that combines all the stories and just tells all the details of the Trojan War. I was a kid, I was stupid. Obviously, from an adult perspective, that was a stupid project. For one reason, there's no point in combining everything into one book. I mean, it would be like trying to combine all the Batman stories into one book, right? It would be like a huge book that nobody could kind of pick up anyways. And then, like, what's the point? Like, if you want to read all the Batman stories, they're out there. You don't need them all in one book. You can just go to the different books and read them. The other thing, which I didn't quite yet realize as a kid, but kind of one of the fascinating things about the Trojan stories, Trojan War stories, is that each author comes at it from a different perspective. And sometimes they contradict each other, and sometimes a character that one author portrays as sympathetic will come off as brutal by another author. So by kind of synthesizing them, you're kind of robbing the authors of their original perspective or their original kind of intent. But yeah, I didn't realize this as a kid. Now this, again, I'm older, I'm 40, so this was back in the 90s. There really was no internet to speak of, so I would find stuff in the library. There wasn't a lot of stuff in the bookstores because, a lot of bookstores don't carry these ancient Greek plays. But you could mail order stuff. So you'd have one book, and then it would you could mail order, they'd give you a list of suggested titles. I just kind of went through and kind of spent my meager money at the time ordering stuff about the Trojan War, most of which I never actually read. Because, it's a bit hard to read through these Greek plays, isn't it? I mean, I know we should. But it takes a bit of discipline, perseverance. So, for example, I had the Trojan Woman, the play, sitting on my shelf for years. I would flip through it. I would read parts of it. I never read the whole thing. Same with the Troilus and Cressida play by Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote a play about the Trojan War. Had that on my shelf for years, flipped through it. I tried so many times to get into it, I think I must have read the first 2 pages 10 times. I just never finished most of these books. That being said, actually, as I get older and kind of feel okay, it's time to start reading these classic books again, it's on my list. Before I die, I would like to actually read the Trojan Woman. I would like to actually read Troilus and Cressida. Maybe I will. But most of these books I never actually read as a kid. The ones I did read were kind of not so much the plays, but the epic poems. And I cheated a bit. For each of these epic poems, I intentionally sought out translations that were not poetic translations. So the Iliad, it's in the original Greek, it's a poem. It's written in a meter and with couplets, I think. And a lot of the authors who have tried to emulate this in English by giving it a meter and kind of couplets and kind of poetic thing. But then some authors won't. Some authors will just say, well, look, here's just the story. We're not going to mess around with the poetry. So I would seek out those translations. So I read the Iliad. I read the Odyssey. I read the Aeneid. Is that how you pronounce it? Aeneid, the Virgil one. The one Virgil wrote about Aeneas. Also, those three are quite famous. There's another one which is a little bit more obscure, which was written in like the 3rd century AD by a guy named Quintus of Smyrna, called, it goes by different names. Sometimes it's called Ilium, I think, or Post-Homerica. And he kind of covers from where kind of Homer leaves off, where the Iliad leaves off. He picks a story and kind of tells all about the death of Achilles and Achilles' son coming in the fall of Troy, and kind of all the stories that Homer doesn't tell, or right kind of where Homer finishes. It's a little bit, I'm a little bit mystified actually that this kind of book isn't more famous than it is, because it's really obscure. Nobody knows about this book. I just found it by chance in the library. But like, I think this is the source for where we get kind of a lot of those major stories that we associate with the Trojan War. I'm a little bit surprised that this author and this book aren't more famous, but it's really, posterity has not been kind to this guy. Well, I mean, I don't know. Anyone who can survive 2,000 years isn't doing that badly. But it's really hard to find information, even nowadays, kind of on Wikipedia and stuff like that, about this book. And actually, I've got a confession. That last one, Post-Homerica by Quintus of Smyrna, I only read half of it, and then I got bored, and it was a library book, so I had to return it. This is another book that maybe I'm due to kind of come back to as an adult and read one day, get around to it later. So yeah, I read kind of a lot about it. I had a lot of the Greek plays, but I didn't read them straight through. I went through these phases where I would kind of get obsessed with some of the minor characters in this story, which is something I do with kind of any fandom I'm involved with. Kind of, I was like this as kind of a Star Trek fan as well, or kind of anything I'm a big fan of. You're like, okay, I'm a little bit sick of Kirk and Spock. I know those guys already. But, this Dr. M. Begala, who only kind of showed up in 2 episodes, what's his story? Let me research all I can about him. You get kind of sick of the major characters and you become obsessed with the minor characters. I think, again, this is a little bit, I'm confessing to being a little bit kind of neurotic here, but I think there's a certain personality type that does this. Especially if you kind of look at fan fiction. There's a lot of fan fiction where they become involved with minor characters and kind of spin them out into their own stories. So there must be some sort of personality trait that does this. So I got really into kind of a lot of the smaller characters in the Trojan War cycle. For example, I got really interested in Teucer. Teucer was Ajax's brother. He was kind of really good with the arrow, like archery. And Ajax would kind of protect him, and he kind of shows up in the Iliad a little bit, and he shows up here and there. He was never really a major character, except there was one play, Helen of Troy, where Helen was kind of stuck in Egypt, and he had kind of a major part in that because sorry, it's a digression. I was really interested in Teucer, and I was kind of always kind of going through the index to read everything up I could about Teucer and all these books. I got really interested in Ajax the Lesser, partly just because I thought it was so interesting that there were 2 Ajaxes. I mean, why? Why have 2 heroes with the exact same name? Like, how did this happen? So, and everybody knows about Ajax the Greater, right? But then, finding all these stories about Ajax the Lesser, and Ajax the Lesser had kind of an interesting part right at the sack of Troy. Like, he was the guy who kind of committed all those outrages against the gods that kind of screwed the Greeks over. But he also pops up in kind of minor positions in all the other stories. Became interested in, I think Achilles had 2 horses that were quite famous. Became interested in them. There were like 2 doctors on the Greek side. There was like these other heroes that you kind of hear a bit about, like Eaminus, I think. And there was a guy whose name starts with M that I don't remember, who was like a mythical king of Athens, who was kind of quite famous as like an antagonist of Theseus and kind of the Theseus stories, but he was also one of the leaders of the Greeks at Troy. And you don't hear a lot about him in kind of the other stories, but he pops up in Homer a lot. Like, you know, in a lot of these fight scenes, he just pops up. You know, these kind of things where kind of teasing out these minor characters became really interesting for me. Yeah, Cassandra. I always thought Cassandra was really interesting. And she had a really kind of interesting story and kind of the whole thing after Troy with Ajax the Lesser, and then she goes back with Agamemnon. A side note here, Cassandra became a really popular name in America in the 1990s. Does anyone know how that happened? I mean, because like, she's kind of a tragic figure. Why did people start naming their daughters Cassandra? I mean, she's a fascinating figure, but you know, her story is very tragic. I don't know how that name became so popular in America. Anyways, kind of going off on a tangent here. So this whole thing snowballed as these kind of interests do. At one point, my mother got me a book on Greek mythology. And I said, no, I'm not interested in Greek mythology. I'm just interested in the Trojan War. And she said, but I know how these things start. And kind of sure enough, once you get into Trojan War, you kind of expand a bit, and then you get into the Greek mythology in general. And from Greek mythology, I got interested in the history of the Greeks and the Romans. I actually ended up getting into the history of the Romans more so than the Greeks. I think partly because Greek history is so confusing. And also because there's just much more written about the Romans, kind of like historical novels and stuff like that. There's a lot more historical novels about kind of Julius Caesar and Cicero than there are about like the Greeks, city-states. And this is kind of one of those things, I guess, that one thing led to another, and eventually your whole life is kind of going down this track. I studied Latin in high school and university because I was interested in Roman history. I wanted to be a classicist, like I enrolled in university as a classics major. And I didn't actually stay with it because, everyone switches majors in university. About kind of halfway through university, I decided I was more interested in modern politics. So I kind of switched to modern history. But I don't know, every now and again, I go through these phases where I start to kind of reminisce about the classics again and think, I should have stuck with that. Actually, I shouldn't have, because it's the most unstable career in the world, trying to get a career in academics in the classics. In fact, the professors who taught me, I think, are no longer employed because my old college ended up shutting down its classics department a few years ago. So, it was probably for the best. But yeah, it's one of those things. Like, to this day, every time I feel embarrassed I don't know Spanish, I say, well, it's because I went through that phase where I was kind of learning Latin because I was obsessed with classical history because of the Trojan War. Like, it all started way back with that thing. Okay, so having kind of given my personal history of the Trojan War, let me just kind of briefly kind of go into what it is. I don't want to get into detail because there's like a million other places you can go to research it. Actually, I think this video, I'm just about up at the time limit. So I'll give kind of a brief summary of the Trojan War and talk about, not everything, but talk about a few of the points that interest me in the next video.